We are back with Bishop Mark MacDonald of the Anglican Church of Canada, talking about what he's hearing from Indigenous people as he travels from communities all across this nation. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
You know, we've been reading in the headlines about the spate of suicides that's happening in Indigenous communities, particularly Nunavut and in the far north, the Arctic. What is driving young people to take their lives at such a high rate?
Well, I think it's a very complex subject, but despair seems to be the largest factor. Despair at poverty, living conditions, identity, all of those things seem to be factors in what is an overwhelming sense of despair.
So it's not an easy fix.
No.
But is there something that we can do to help, or, you know, here in the South or throughout Canada?
Well, I think prayer is, we believe in prayer, and we believe that prayer is a part of the answer, and prayer speaks directly to the despair that's ongoing. Spirituality is such an important part of the overall answer, and a communal spirituality, which is so much a part of healthy Indigenous life. That's so important, and the Christian message is such a powerful help to that. I think that the resilience of Indigenous people is great, but there seems to be a kind of overwhelming despair that is particularly, the young people are particularly vulnerable to.
You know, we talked in the first half of this interview about Indigenous Christianity, how it changes when it's Indigenous. Tell me some of the ways that it changes. I know that communal aspect is one.
Yeah. Well, I think we're having a group of 38 people here for a leadership week this week, and one of the things that we'll do is we'll spend a lot of time in prayer. We'll spend a lot of time reading the gospel and engaging the gospel and having the gospel engage us. That's a unique part of Indigenous faith. It might sound like everybody else does it, but we really, 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 really do it. We'll have a gospel jamboree, which is a very important part of our Indigenous Christian faith. The singing and sharing and testimony, those kinds of things, they're really a big part of what our life is together when it's in a healthy way.
You know, you mentioned some of the challenges toward the despair that's driving kids to suicide is the poverty and the living conditions. And I can't help thinking that some of that ties back to residential schools, even racism in this country. You know, we've been talking a lot about it because of what's happening down south of the border. But here in Canada, people are saying a lot of racism is directed toward First Peoples. Do you see that?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think in ways that are subtle to the people that are kind of infected by, but not subtle for those who are victims of it. So you can see this. I hear it all the time in what comments I hear. There's a sense of overall despair about Indigenous people that doesn't recognize the resilience and really the strength and grace that it was necessary to survive the kinds of difficulties that have been along the way.
And I think the graciousness too, you know, when you think about the treaties and the faith that Indigenous people entered into relationship with Europeans, and the way that, you know, you think that we'd almost have civil war at this point in some sense, you know, where there's been disappointment or a sense that the treaties aren't being honored, and yet there's so much grace, I find.
Yes, yes.
You know, you talked about the subtle nature of racism in our hearts. How do we, as people of faith particularly, because it is in people of faith's hearts too, how do we recognize that and overcome it?
Well, I think that you should constantly be critiquing yourself in the sense of, do I do I see the fullness of the humanity that God has given to this people that I'm thinking about, that I'm interacting with, or that I'm not interacting with? Do I see the fullness of humanity that God has given them? Do I grant them the freedom to express what God intended them to be? Do I have the do I have attitudes and thoughts that limit the extent to which a person can be free in God to be who they're meant to be?
There's a verse in the Bible that talks about, search me, O God, and know my heart, and see if there's any evil way in me. And it's a daily thing we have to do about all of life. But I think particularly at this time and around this issue of racism, so important. Thank you so much,
Thank
Bishop
you.
MacDonald, for taking time with us today. And
Thank you.
we could go on and on and on.
Yes. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Okay.
We'll be right back.